Hello, Brobs. I was going to read this version of A Midsummer's Night's Dream by William Shakespeare, not because the internet needs another, but because of this article by Gundella the Witch, whom I have researched for a good 12, 13 years, probably 14 years now. And so I'm going to go with a different version of the book, which is a 1912 version, which after looking it over today, much earlier, I noticed it has a introduction. Look at that. About how Shakespeare introduced basically rewrote the history of so-called fairies just through his play itself. But let's read Marion Kuklow's Witch Watch column on Midsummer's Festival from June 19th, 1975. Don't mind me, I've had a spooky tooth pumpkin beer, and needless to say, I'm a lightweight, so a 9.0 beer kicked my ass. So don't hold me to any discrepancies here in this reading. Lay aside summer's work for Midsummer Festival, and this appeared in the Observer and Eccentric newspapers in Detroit suburbs, many Detroit suburbs. My favorite Shakespearean play has never been Hamlet, Macbeth, or even Romeo and Juliet. I much prefer the merry comedy of A Midsummer Night's Dream. The enchantments, the love spells, the magical mix-ups caused by frolicking fairies are all reminiscent of the folk tales from many lands about the mysterious things that can happen on Midsummer's Night. Today, there is some confusion as to whether June 21st or June 24th should rightly be called Midsummer Day. I mean, honestly, August 21st to 24th should be Midsummer Day because it's actually midsummer, which is why I started reading this. But I guess Midsummer Day back then, June 21st, is the longest day of the year, so I suppose that's why it was called Midsummer. I'm not sure why. The summer solstice. This was the day on which pagan people laid aside their hard summer work for a while for the fun and frolic of the Midsummer Festival. From June 21st on, the hours of sunlight diminish. So on the third day after the solstice, great fires were lighted, and rituals held to strengthen the sun, much like the Baal fires burned on February 2nd to call the sun back for spring. The vigor and extent of the crops were believed to be governed by the height of the flames. People would join hands and jump over the flames. Leaping of this kind was a common folk custom intended to stimulate the crops by example. The higher they jumped, the higher they believed the crops would grow. When the early Christian church was attempting to convert pagans, June 24th was proclaimed the eve of the birth of St. John the Baptist. Thus, pagans could become Christians and still celebrate this date by lighting fires. Only now the fires were lighted to honor St. John and were called Johannes fires. In ancient times, witches, along with other pagan groups, celebrated the Midsummer Festival. However, it is considered a minor or lesser Sabbath among modern witches, Wiccans, and there is disagreement from coven to coven, even among the most traditional, as to which night, June 21st or 24th, should be celebrated, because both were once part of the pagan Midsummer Festival, which lasted several days. As a result, many no longer observe it at all, since it is not one of the major or greater Sabbaths. Although most dictionaries list June 24th as Midsummer, and that is the day the coven to which I belong recognizes but seldom celebrates. June 21st was the day we observed when I was a child. On that night, each person would break a hen's egg, and one's future would be read from the splattered egg, much the same way as people read tea leaves. It was also customary for young girls to sleep with yarrow under their pillow in order to dream of their future mates. Fern seed gathered on Midsummer Day and properly used was said to make men invisible. Shakespeare referred to the custom in Henry IV, Part 1. We have the receipt of fern seed. We walk invisible. My grandmother always allowed us to stay up late on June 21st to watch the fairies dance at midnight, wrapped in blankets because June nights in northern Michigan can be cold. We would sit quietly beneath the trees, watching the open field across the way. The older folks had told us so many tales and fairies and elves about fairies and elves dancing beneath the moon at midnight that I could almost imagine I really saw them. Although my brother always said they were just lightning bugs in the tall, wet grass. Maybe you'd like to watch for them yourself on this midsummer's night, but don't be too disappointed if you don't see them. Those fairies may be using the fern seed. Right. Anyway, let's get to, who is this guy? Let's see who the frick this guy is. Edited by William Allen Nelson and Ashley Horace Thorndike, which I assume is a dude. What the fuck happened here? A Midsummer's Night Dream, bruv. Billy Shakespeare. This is the text used in the Nielsen text, copyrighted in 1906 by William Allen Nelson. Billy Nelson, just like Billy Shakespeare. What are we at? 7 minutes? We may be able to get through this introduction, you fucking dummy. Let me do this. Introduction. The stationer's registers for 1600 contain an entry under the date October 8th of a license to Thomas Fisher for a book called A Midsummer Night's Dream, and this obviously refers to what is now known as the first quarto, the title of which runs A Midsummer Night's Dream, as it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants, written by William Shakespeare and printed at London for Thomas Fisher, and are to be sold at his shop, at the sign of the White Hart, in Fleet Street, 1600. The Nielsen text used in the present issue of the play is based upon Q. 1. There is another quarto, 2, with the title A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it hath been sundry times publicly acted by the Right Honourable the Lord Chamberlain, his servants, written by William Shakespeare, printed by James Robert, 1600, but recent investigation by messengers Pollard, Gregg, and Neidig indicates that this was a piratical edition, really published not in 1600 but in 1619. It follows Q1 page by page and differs from it chiefly in the correction of minor errors and the addition of some stage directions. Further stage directions and the division into acts were added in the first folio edition of Shakespeare's plays, 1623. The folio text of A Midsummer's Night's Dream being apparently set up from a stage copy of Q2, as Q2 had been set up from a copy of Q1. Date of composition. The one bit of certain and important evidence under this head is that A Midsummer's Night Dream is mentioned by Francis Maris in his Palladis Tamia, which was published in 1598. Most editors agree that the play was written about 1594 to 95. This conclusion is supported by various considerations as to the workmanship of the play, its versification, the skill displayed in the character drawing, the richness of the humor, and the supreme lyrical note, which suggests that A Midsummer Night's Dream was composed about the same time as Romeo and Juliet. where we find in Mercutio's Queen Mab speech Shakespeare's mind again at play with fairy lore. This date also agrees with somewhat doubtful allusions which have been discerned in the play itself. Can I go to a full page? I don't think I can. Kind of want to, honestly. Where the hell was I? This date also agrees with somewhat doubtful allusions which have been discerned in the play itself. Of these, the most trustworthy appears to be Titania's description of the unseasonable weather resulting from her quarrel with Oberon, which would have additional point if the audience had in mind the summer of 1594. Several contemporary authorities make mention of this as an unusually wet season. The lines, the thrice three muses mourning for the death of learning, late deceased in beggary, describe very accurately one of Spenser's minor poems, The Tears of the Muses, which was published in 1591. But poems of this kind were not uncommon. A parallel for the lion scenes has been found in the substitutions of a moor for a lion that should have drawn a triumphal car at the baptism of Prince Henry of Scotland on August 30th, 1594, because his presence might have brought some fear to the nearest, but this is probably nothing more than a coincidence. The attempt to connect a Midsummer Night's Dream with some courtly marriage, at best a conjecture, affords no clue as to the date. Sources. The relation of Theseus to Hippolyta and the names of Aegis and Philostrate Shakespeare found or might have found in the Knight's Tale of Chaucer. Lysander and Demetrius are names in Norse Plutarch, a volume which Shakespeare used for his Roman plays, and from which he took also some minor allusions in A Midsummer Night's Dream. I guess I could. There we go. Titania, Titan-born, is an epithet applied by Ovid in Metamorphoses 3, 173, to Diana, with whom the Elizabethans sometimes identified the Queen of the Fairies. If Shakespeare took the name from this passage in Ovid, he took it from the original, and not from Arthur Golding's translation of the Metamorphoses, to which he may have been indebted for the popular story of Paramus and Thisbe. In all these cases, the debt is slight, for there is no play in which Shakespeare worked with greater originality or made his material more completely his own. Bottom and his companions must have been drawn from life, and though Shakespeare no doubt heard and read a great deal of fairy lore, he created more than he borrowed. The English-speaking world of today has taken its conception of the fairy kingdom from Shakespeare to an even greater extent than our forefathers took their demonology from Milton. It's a great line. How many Shakespeare owed to his grandam for many a woman's story at a winter's fire about fairy pranks can never be determined, and it may be that main sources of A Midsummer Night's Dream were gathered from his playfellows in the woods and fields about Stratford, but the fairies exist for us as his imagination made them. Fairy lore before Shakespeare. Fairy literature is a province by itself, and those who are curious about such matters in relation to this play will find them excellently sent forth by Mr. Frank Sidgwick in the sources and analogues of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Fairies play a large part in Celtic literature, and modern anthropologists are inclined to find a natural explanation for their origin in an imaginative view of the doings of the smaller race which inhabited the British Isles before the Celts subjugated them or drove them to the wilds. But we may be content to go no further back than Chaucer, whose Wife of Bath, not without a touch of irony, speaks of the fairies as driven out by the friars, of whom, of course, women need have no fear. In the old days of the King Arthur, of which the Britons specken great honor, all with this was this land fulfilled of farrier. The fuck is fairs, I guess that's how you said fairy then, the elf queen with her jolly company danced full often many a green mead. This was the old opinion, as I read. I speak of many 100 years ago, but now can no man see none elves mole. The English country people were, however, not all skeptical as the wife of Bath, and the belief in fairies lasted till long after Shakespeare's time in the more remote parts of the kingdom. Spenser turned it to literary uses in The Faerie Queene, the first three books of which were published in 1590, and there are abundant references to fairies and other poets and prose writers contemporary with Shakespeare. Shakespeare, the best storehouse of information as to popular superstitions about fairies, is Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, which gives, among much other curious lore, a charm to invest people with horses' or asses' heads. Scott was himself skeptical enough as to the superstition she was trying to do away with, and he is careful to ascribe to a bygone age the belief in the pranks of Robin Goodfellow, of which he gives a description agreeing in the main with the fairy's account of Puck's doings in A Midsummer Night's Dream 2, I 32 through 41. Robin Goodfellow would supply the office of servants, especially of maids, as to make a fire in the morning, sweep the house, grind mustard and malt, draw water, etc. But again, Shakespeare's conception of the character of Puck is not Reginald Scott's. It is his own, though obviously founded upon the folklore of his time. Relations to contemporary drama, Shakespeare was not the first to bring fairies on the English stage. There are earlier references to a play called The King of the Fairies, and Henslowe mentions one in his diary as acted in December to January 1593 to 1594, the title of which was Huon of Bordeaux, a hero of romance identical with Oberon. Oberon, King of Fairies, is one of the characters in Green's Scottish History of James IV, entered in the Stationer's Registers on May 14, 1594, and probably written 2 or 3 years before the author's death in 1592. Oberon is a subordinate character extraneous to the action of Green's play, which he introduces and enlivens with fairy dances. There are fairy dances and songs in Lely's Endymion, which was printed in 1591, and Lely, in the prologue to The Women in the Moon, says, "Remember, all is but a poet's dream," a hint which Shakespeare seems to have used in the title of this play and in Puck's epilogue. Lely's habit of identifying his characters with contemporaneous persons is adopted by Shakespeare to the extent of an obvious reference to Queen Elizabeth in Part 2. Fair Vestal throned by the west, against whom Cupid's shafts are powerless. The imperial votaress passed on in maiden meditation, fancy-free. But whether there is an allusion here to a particular assault made upon Elizabeth's heart by the Earl of Leicester at the famous Kenilworth festivities of 1575 is open to question. Kenilworth is not far from Stratford, and Shakespeare may have been present. But even if this were so, he evidently refreshed his memory of what he had seen as a boy of 11 by reading Gascoigne's pamphlet, The Princely Pleasure of Kenilworth Castle, published in 1576 and again in 1587, to which the passage in A Midsummer Night's Dream bears some striking resemblances in points of detail, as I have endeavored to show in the Modern Language Review 4/231. The writer may be permitted to refer the reader to another paper of his on the mask in Shakespeare's plays, an archive für das Studium der neuen Sprachen und Literaturen, in which reasons are given for not accepting the current view that A Midsummer Night's Dream approximates to the type of the Elizabethan mask. for the Elizabethan masque as Shakespeare knew it and introduced it in his plays Romeo and Juliet, and the note thereon in the Tudor edition of that play may be consulted with advantage. Style. There are more rhymes than blank verse in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and its lyrical excellence is a perpetual joy to anyone who has an ear. And then I lost the whole fucking thing. Let me pause this. All right, bruv. Style. There are more rhymes than blank verse in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and its lyrical excellence and is a perpetual joy to anyone who has an ear for concord of sweet sounds. Even the blank verse has an uplifting and enthralling music, as if Shakespeare were giving full rein to his youthful mastery of a full-toned instrument. We have not, indeed, the orchestral effects of his later manner, for the range of the chords he uses is comparatively limited, but in its own kind of poetry, the play was and is still unsurpassed. Meredith described one of the most delightful chapters of Richard Feverel as a diversion played upon a penny whistle, and with some extension of and apology for the metaphor, it might be applied without derogation to this play. Love's musical instrument is as old and as poor. It has but two stops, and yet you see the cunning musician does thus much with it. Shakespeare takes his young lovers even less seriously than Meredith does his in this famous chapter, and yet he has touched the pipes with such power that A Midsummer Night's Dream might stand, in Edgar Allan Poe's opinion, for a definition of poetry. Stage history, no other comedy, if we accept references to Falstaff, had anything like so many allusions made to it up to 1649. Its lines are imitated and echoed by Dekker, Ford, Chapman, Marston, Fletcher, and Massinger. It was evidently from the beginning a very popular play. In 1602, a burlesque called Narcissus, obviously imitated from the interlude of Paramus and Thisbe, was acted at St. John's College, Oxford, and in 1631, the Bishop of Lincoln was accused of having A Midsummer Night's Dream acted at his house on Sunday evening for his private delectation, to the great scandal of his Puritan enemies. Under the Commonwealth, the jests of Bottom, the Weaver were presented by stealth, under pretense of rope dancing or the like, and immediately after the Restoration, an enterprising publisher, considering the general mirth that is likely very suddenly to happen about the king's coronation, hastened to offer the public the merry conceited humours of Bottom the Weaver, as it hath been often publicly acted by some of his Majesty's comedians, and lately privately presented by several apprentices for their harmless recreation, with great applause. The play had also by this time attained a hold in Germany, probably through the visits of the English actors, for in 1663 there was printed a Schimpfspiel or Pasquinade by Andreas Gryphius, entitled Absurda Comica, or Her Peter Squence, which is largely taken from the low comedy part of A Midsummer Night's Dream, though Bottom loses his leadership to Pickle Herring and his name to Bulla Boutain, Bellows Maker. The English public of the Restoration theatres apparently lost its sense of humor along with its taste for poetry, for Evelyn wrote in his diary in 1661, having seen Hamlet acted, now the old plays began to discuss this refined age, since his Majesty's being so long abroad, and Pepys enters under the date September 29, 1662, to the King's Theatre, where we saw A Midsummer Night's Dream, which I had never seen before, nor shall ever again, for it is the most insipid, ridiculous play that ever I saw in my life. In 1692, the comedy furnished the libretto for an opera, with instrumental and vocal parts by Purcell and dances by priests, in which a Chinese woman, and 6 monkeys appeared. The court and town were wonderfully satisfied with it. These farcical and operatic features vied for prominence during the 18th century performances, In one, Bottom and his companions were omitted. In another, Theseus and all the serious characters. An operatic revival in 1816 stated that the play had not been acted for 50 years, and the English critics of the first half of the 19th century, from Hazlitt to Knight, agreed that A Midsummer Night's Dream was unmanageable for the stage. German theatrical managers were of the same opinion, and it was due to the enthusiasm of Ludwig Tieck, backed by the munificence of Frederick William IV, that the play at theater at last received a fitting presentation at the Berlin Royal Theater in 1827, with the music that Mendelssohn had composed the year before. Mendelssohn's music was again used at a notable revival in London under Charles Keene in 1856, when Puck was acted by a child, a blonde, roguish girl about 10 years old, who afterwards became a favorite Shakespearean actress under the name of Ellen Terry. During the last half century, revivals have been numerous, and modern resources in the way of lighting and scenery have made performances possible which would have struck Shakespeare's fellows at the Globe dumb with admiration. Bottom is still a notable part for a comic actor, and there is every sign that A Midsummer's Night Dream will continue to hold its own both as an acting as an reading play. Interpretation. The comedy fortunately affords no opportunity to the ingenious critics for fantastic theories. Commentators have rarely withheld their meed of admiration, and though some have drawn attention to the incongruity of the material, it is of the highest tribute to Shakespeare's skill that the ordinary reader who looks only for enjoyment does not notice it. It needed no slight art indeed to bring into the same canvas the heroes of Greek mythology in their medieval dress, the rude mechanicals who were really Shakespeare's contemporaries, and the fairies who belonged to no time or place. Only Shakespeare would have attempted such a task, and only shape-shifting Shakespeare could have done it successfully. Yet we are conscious of no trace of effort, only of a full tide of poetry and fun that carries everything before it. The plot is of the slightest, and the youthful lovers are only sketched in, but who gives a thought to such considerations in reading or seeing the play? Theseus and Hippolyta are drawn with deeper and more powerful strokes, and Bottom, and I hope that's the name, and his companions are as much Shakespeare's own in their exquisite stupidity as the fairies are in their irresponsible daintiness. Those who look for the tragedy of bright things came to confusion will find it in Romeo and Juliet, which Shakespeare wrote about the same time. Here he shows only the waywardness and folly of young love. However deeply he may sympathize with it in his heart, in this play, insofar as he ever identified himself with any of his characters, his point of view is rather that of Puck. Lord, what fool these mortals be. And that's that long-winded motherfucking introduction. Not that I had to add Gondela's article, but I felt an explanation for why I was even reading this to begin with. I have no conception of what this is about, and I only read it in the endeavor of knowing more about Gondela the Witch, aka Marion Kuklu. Goodbye, Rob. Goodbye.